Welcome to my channel. Subscribe my channel.
Dawn burned thin and pale over the red dust of Central Australia.
Dawn burned thin and pale over the red dust of Central Australia. The outback lay quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel loud. Birds had not yet started their first calls. Kangaroos rested in loose groups, heads down, chewing. Dr. Maya Harris stood on the ridge with her binoculars, breath steaming in the cool air. Her field pack sagged at her feet. She had been here for 3 months, watching how water moved across the land, jotting notes Vera never read. Today felt different. A low hum crawled along the horizon, soft at first, then sharper, like the sound of a wasp trapped in a tin can. Maya frowned and lifted the binoculars. At the far edge of the saltbush plain, a silver shape cut the sky. It fell from cloudless air like a coin dropped into honey. For a second it did not move, only hovered, then settled near the dried rim of a billabong and pressed into the ground with a hiss that made the sand shiver. Maya fumbled with her radio. Static. No replies. The hum changed to a sequence of high and low notes that the recorder on her belt picked up as a thin, repeating song. She felt the hush around the camp tighten. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Down in the shallow water, a pair of galahs landed and watched, tilting their heads. A dingo in the distance sat up and bared its teeth at nothing. Nearer, a mob of kangaroos rose at once, eyes alert. The animals did not flee. They gathered instead, forming a loose circle as if instinct told them the new thing must be observed, not chased. Maya moved slowly, careful to reduce her silhouette. She had met ugly machines in the lab, harsh cold steel and glass, but nothing like this. The ship looked grown, not built. Smooth plates like river stones, seams filled with faint blue veins that pulsed with light. As she watched, a seam opened and glass pods like beetle shells slid out and scattered into the scrub. They were small and quick, black as wet stones, with legs that clicked over twig and rock. The pods did not walk like insects. They skittered with purpose, bumping into leaves, probing bark, and then one tapped the trunk of a dead eucalyptus. It glowed where it touched, and a pulse ran up the tree like lightning under wet paper. The pulse smelled faintly of ozone and something sweet like crushed gum leaves. At once, the scrub erupted. Cockatoos exploded from the canopy and swarmed the pod in a white, screaming cloud. They pecked metal and glass with angry beaks. The pod flailed, spat a light that made the birds blink, and then a flock of magpies came down like a storm, talons and beaks striking. The tiny machine gave a high chitter and retreated into the shadows, only to find a goanna waiting, its forked tongue tasting the air. The goanna lunged and the pod spun, stunned, as the big lizard chewed on its casing. Maya's heart thudded hard enough for her to hear. Her recorder ran, capturing the chaos. The screams of birds, the dry clap of claws, the low mechanical whine. The animals were everywhere. They did not scatter in fear. They attacked with a strange order. One group distracted, another flanked, another harassed from trees. It was not random, it was a pattern. She thought of the reports the world had sent in the last few hours. Lights over cities, ships in orbit, towers appearing near coasts. Governments had announced unknown crafts and urged calm. The official lines felt thin and distant here. Out in the bush, life was doing something else entirely. Nearby, a wombat ambled toward the nearest pod and began to dig in front of it with sudden, urgent energy. The pod tried to rise and then slipped in the soft sand, its sensors blinking as if confused. A pair of bats launched from an old hollow and fell on the machine's upper vents, slipping wings into the airflow and fogging its optics. The pod skittered away, pursued by a line of ants that poured over its legs like a living tide. The ants ate at joints, at seams, at exposed wiring. Even the small things joined the assault. Maya stood, hands numb, as wave after wave of animals descended. They showed no fear of her, no fear of the ship. A single cockatoo landed on the hood of the silver craft and jabbed at an inlet with its beak until glass cracked with a sound like ice breaking. The craft shuddered. A seam opened and another pod crawled out. This one moved faster and let out a shrill note. The note rolled across the plain and something answered, a deep, thrumming vibration under the soil. Kangaroos thumped the ground with such force that dust rose in a small storm. The vibration made the pod falter, its legs sinking into sand. Maya's radio finally picked up a voice, thin with static. "Control here. All units," it cut. Then a voice she had heard only once on a training call, her old supervisor Vera. "Do you copy?" Any sign, background noise swallowed the rest. Maya thumbed the recorder to record everything. She felt small in the middle of a living storm, a human in the crowd of a war she had never expected. As the light climbed, the sky filled with flying shapes, hundreds of birds, a few bats, a wedge-tailed eagle that circled and dove, talons out. The animals moved with a purpose that felt older than their bones. Maya whispered to herself a single word, not sure if it was prayer or command, "Stay." She thought of the land, of rivers and gnarly trees and the stubborn life that grew in rock cracks, and she knew with a clarity that shocked her, that something ancient and angry had awakened in simple things. The invaders, bright and precise, had tried to slip into a world that would not be taken without a voice. And that voice, sharp, hoarse, and full of claws, had just begun to answer. By noon the outback looked half the world and half a war zone. The silver ship sat scarred and smoking where it had landed. Pods lay crushed beneath kangaroo feet and bird beaks. Where the craft had pressed into the soil, the earth was pale and steamed like a wound. Maya walked closer with Tom, her neighbor, and Lien, a wildlife ranger. Tom carried a shovel. Lien had binoculars and a calm mouth that rarely opened. They moved through the aftermath watching the animals. Most kept to their business, nibbling, preening, grooming wounds, but their eyes stayed on the ship. No one came close unless the animals allowed it. Even the dingoes kept a wide ring, ears forward and low, moving like ghosts around the scene. They found a tower half a kilometer away, slim and black and humming. It stood planted among spinifex like a new tree. Thin threads of vapor rose from rings in its base, and the soil nearby had gone stiff and dead, grass flayed into brown strands. Maya crouched and touched the sand. It was warm and dry inside, as if the tower sucked water from the ground with invisible teeth. "Radiation?" Tom asked. He chewed his lip. "I saw one of those on the news. They said these things sterilize land to stop pests." Maya thought of the pods, the pulse up the eucalyptus, the way the animals had attacked. "Not pests," she said slowly. "They don't understand the system here. They're trying to make everything neat. That tower is pulling moisture and life out. The animals are reacting." Lien pointed. A pair of cockatoos watched the tower from a branch and bobbed their heads in an odd rhythm. A goanna sat on a sun-warmed rock, tongue flicking, and every time the tower pulsed, it turned like a gear to face it, as if listening. "They're focusing," Lien said. "Like it's an antenna." Men and women from town began to crowd along the scrub edge. A military detail arrived in harsh green, rifles slung. They set up perimeter lines and broadcast orders. Officials spoke into cameras back toward the city in voices meant to calm people far away. In the outback, their words did not land. The animals watched the soldiers with the sort of attention that measured danger and remembered names. Someone suggested bait. The thought came like an ugly idea. Trucks brought cattle from a nearby station. Bulky, slow animals driven by men in wide hats. They thought the invaders would fear large, noisy creatures. The soldiers planned to herd the cattle near the tower and then push them forward, a living wedge. Maya watched the cattle file past the edge and felt a cold hand settle in her chest. The kangaroos did not throw themselves at the machines that time. They lined up instead, a strange wall at the far side of the plain, watching. The cattle stepped forward, beasts tossing heads and kicking up dust. A pod came from the tower and probed the air. It ignored the cattle and moved, with a silent, precise glide, toward a cluster of small mammals working the soil, bandicoots and rat kangaroos, snuffling and scraping. When it touched the ground among them, the small mammals did not run. Their noses twitched and then they swarmed, biting and scratching. The pod sparked and fled to the shadow of a spinifex hummock. A magpie dove and pulled at its casing. The cattle stampeded, not because of the aliens, but because the flock of birds forced them. Panic rippled through the men and the machines. Tom cursed. "It ignores the big ones," he said, shaking his head. "Why?" "Because the small ones matter here," Maya said. "The aliens look for the biggest units and try to control them. They think if they take over big animals or big places, they win. But this place works in tiny pieces. Everything links through the small stuff." That evening the town tried to send a drone up for a view. The drone lifted, buzzing like a fly, and a wedge-tailed eagle circled, eyeing it. When the drone hovered above the tower, thousands of insects rose from the ground like a thick cloud and slammed into its propellers. The machine went wild and dropped to the spinifex, where ants took it apart in minutes. No one had expected the insects to be allies. Maya played back audio on her recorder. Under the metallic notes from the tower there was a pattern that was not mechanical. Low undercurrents of sound came from the soil, soft like stones rubbed together. She slowed the recording and listened. The soil thrum matched the pattern of the kangaroo thumping earlier. A byte of data stitched into a new fear. "They're reading the land," Leon said quietly. "Not just the animals. The soil. The water. They're mapping life as a signal." Around a lonely pub on the highway, a small group argued. Some townsfolk wanted to shoot the animals they thought dangerous. Others wanted to capture pods. Emotions ran raw. "We can take them," someone said. "We have guns." No one listened to the animals' quiet counsel. A patrolman turned his rifle toward a flock of noisy cockatoos that had taken to landing on the diesel tanks near the trucks. He raised his weapon and fired. The shot cracked and a bird fell, feathers blown in a soft, terrible rain. For a second the whole plane froze. The birds quieted. Then one by one the animals stepped forward, not attacking the man but stepping to form a ring around the fallen bird. The soldiers hesitated. Night came thick and black, and with it a new kind of sound, human radios murmuring, the soft rustle of animals settling, and a low mechanical groan as more pods crawled from the ship. Their little legs clicked. They left pale tracks in the sand like tiny prints of worry. Maya lay awake beside a small fire, elbows on her knees. The stars were sharp and cold. She thought of the maps she had drawn of water flow, of how small springs fed rivers that fed the sea. She thought of how people in cities believed they could shape the land as they wished. The invaders had come with a plan to make Earth neat for them. They had not counted on a language that was older than metal, a language of calls and vibration and patient, connected life. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the next day. Would the aliens bring more towers? Would they change their method? Would they learn too late that the outback did not belong to one kind of mind? Around her, a single fox-like dingo raised its head and sang a long, thin note that trembled like a thread. It answered no one and everything. Maya picked up her recorder and spoke into the night, voice steady. "If they want this land," she said, "they will have to answer for it." Dawn came with a bruise of purple over the horizon. The towers had multiplied overnight, thin black sentinels rising like a new forest. From the town, soldiers moved in columns, helmets tight, radios clicking orders. The invaders worked with quiet efficiency, placing more towers along the water lines and around scrub patches. Each tower pulsed on its own slow rhythm, drawing moisture into pale rings where plants wilted and the soil became powder. But the land had learned to speak back. Around mid-morning, the first coordinated assault began. It started small, a pair of magpies harrying a pod, a band of possums tipping over a sensor with nimble paws, but the hits came fast and in patterns that stopped looking accidental. The birds knew where to strike so the machines could not right themselves. The lizards pulled at cable sheaths. Termites worked at soft joints until casings opened. Bats went for vents and filled them with fur and breath. It felt like watching 1,000 small hands learn the same task at once. Maya watched from a ridge, the hum of the towers in her chest. She filmed a flock of corellas sweep low over a sensor array, wings beating in a rhythm that matched a kangaroo's thump nearby. The recording showed what she now understood. The animals were not just reacting, they were coordinating through signals she could not yet explain. When a coil on a tower heated and glowed, insects would crawl in, clogging moving parts. When a pod tried to crawl into a burrow, a goanna would block the entrance and hold it like a guard. The military tried brute force. They fired canisters that burst in flashes and stung the animals with chemicals meant to drive them away. The plan failed. The chemical haze only angered the birds. They flew more recklessly, striking metal and human alike. Soldiers found themselves unable to predict where the next attack would come from, sky, ground, or water. The invaders' machines were precise. The animals were messy and adaptive. Precision could be planned for. Mess could not. A convoy moved to cut off one tower. Engineers in insulated suits approached with tools, confident their shields would stop any biological interference. They kneaded their gloves into sockets and opened panels. For a moment it seemed they would succeed. Then the ground vibrated. First a low, rhythmic thump that turned into a drumbeat as hundreds of kangaroos pounded in unison, stamping soil into dust. The vibration made the engineers' instruments misread their positions. A small pump backed up and leaked. In the chaos, a flock of parrots dove into open panels, pulling at cables. The pump jammed. Sparks flew. The tower shuddered and went silent. Maya noticed a pattern in the attacks she had not seen before. The animals focused on support systems rather than weapons. They chewed wires, clogged vents, and took out power nodes. It was clever in a way that did not need human words. Hit the parts that make the machine work, not the shiny faceplate. It was a kind of engineering done with teeth and beaks. In the scrub, a new player arrived. The saltwater croc from a nearby river that had wandered far from home. It slid into a poisoned creek where a tower had begun to leach the water and rolled over, jaws clamping a sensor the size of a bread box. Men fired at it. The croc did not move. It held the sensor like a prize. Later, the device was found mashed and melted in its mouth, wiring exposed like entrails. Scientists arrived by helicopter, huddled in mud-stiff boots and carrying test kits. They wanted to capture a pod for study. They set traps and placed baits. For 3 days the pods ignored the baited snares and crawled toward the dunes, where a hidden colony of ants waited. The ants swarmed mechanical legs, pulling at tiny screws and dragging pieces into the sand. When the scientists dug the devices out, they found casings peeled back and tiny circuits chewed clean. Maya worked with Lien to collect samples. They were careful not to touch the pods directly. Whatever pathway activated the animals could be transferred. Some of the smashed devices pulsed weakly, emitting noises like a throat clearing. Maya listened and felt a strange prickle in her teeth, a long-buried memory she could not place. The viral pheromone theory gained traction. The first pulse that had hit the eucalyptus was not cruelly designed to kill. It had been an accidental signal. When the pods had struck bark and stone, they released a chemical that stuck to leaves, mixed with sap, and changed the scent the land used to talk. The result was a cascade. Animals smelling the new scent adjusted their calls, their flocking moves, their hunting odd jobs. The scent served as a conductor, and suddenly a million voices had a chorus. Not all responses were coordinated. A child in town wandered too close to a fallen pod and touched it with a bare hand. He screamed as a short, bright discharge shocked him. He lived but with a hand swollen and bruised. Parents blamed the unknowns and demanded the military sweep them clean. Angry men prepared machines to clear the scrub. The more humans tried to force the field, the more the animals defended their territory in furious waves. By the end of the week, the tally was clear. Towers offline, pods incapacitated, and alien attempts to change the environment stalled. The invaders adapted, machines with thicker casings, drones that moved in silent arcs, but the wildlife adapted too in a more natural arms race. Creatures who had never cooperated began to act as units. A flock of cockatoos distracted while a pack of dingoes flanked. A colony of termites undermined a tower base by eating through a wooden stake the invaders had left as a marker. It was improvisation on a scale that no design could anticipate. That night, as fires burned low and groups gathered to plan, Maya sat with an old Aboriginal custodian named Jara. He had walked these lands for decades and knew the names of grasses like children. He tapped the ground with his boot and looked up at the stars. "Country talking back?" he asked in a voice like rainfall. Maya nodded. "Something like that," she said. "But it feels like the animals learned a language too fast. It's as if a conductor took the notes and made them one." Jara thought, then said, "Always was one. We just did not listen with our ears the way you do. Now the rest of you must learn." Maya felt the weight of his words. The strike had not been a single moment. It was a shifting campaign of small, bright victories and hard losses. The wildlife had shown no malice toward humans when they tried to help. Instead, they worked like neighbors, protective, wary, unstoppable when roused. As the embers lowered and the stars burned cleaner, Maya looked toward the black line of towers and felt a knot of fear and fierce hope. The invaders had come with plans and edges. The land had fought back with teeth, wings, and an old, patient intelligence. The battle was not over. It had only found its true face. Dawn smelled of smoke and gum leaf. The damaged tower stumps smoked like camp kettles. Around the fire, people argued and compared notes like scattered scientists trying to stitch a single cloth. Soldiers wanted to push harder. The town elders wanted to retreat. Maya wanted to learn. She had a recorder full of animal calls and a pocket full of smashed pod fragments that still pulsed faintly when the wind hit them. Lien brought news from the lab truck. "We found traces in the eucalyptus bark," she said, voice low. "A compound that looks engineered. It changes the olfactory receptors in animals. Not outright poison, but it tweaks how they read other signals. It makes their calls more synchronized. It makes them listen to a new conductor." Maya frowned, thinking of the first pulse in the pods that had felt like beetles. They did not mean to start a war. They meant to make the land fit their models. They tried to tag the ecosystem like a project. They didn't know how fragile the network is. They set up a small tent at the edge of the scrub as a lab and meeting place. Scientists walked in with field microscopes and tired eyes. A young biochemist, Noor, had a grin that came out when she found interesting trouble. She held up a thin slide and showed them cells lighting up under a tiny lens. "It binds to receptor proteins," she said. "But look, when animals are exposed, their vocal cords and muscles are affected too. It doesn't just change smell, it changes behavior sequences." Maya tested the broken shards carefully. A pod chip flashed weakly when she breathed close and the softest note trailed through the tent, an echo of that first hum. Noor's eyes widened. "It's a signal," she whispered. "A carrier wave with an overlay of chemical cues. The aliens are broadcasting a syntax for life. If we can mimic the overlay, maybe we can change the pattern." Noor worked day and night, distilling oils from crushed gum leaves and mixing them with residues from pod fragments. The result was crude and smelled bitter and sweet at once. When they released a few drops near a group of lorikeets in a trap, the birds fluttered and then settled into a curious, coordinated pecking. The lorikeets began to pull at a metal flap that had been blocking a box. Inside was a captured pod, its case half open. The plan formed like light through trees. Rather than fight the invaders with guns, mimic their communication and guide the wildlife. If the humans could learn to speak the land's new dialect, they could steer animals away from towns and toward disabling devices. It was risky, manipulating the same pathways the aliens used, but the alternative was to let machines reshape everything. They trained. Not in a gym or a firing range, but in empty paddocks and dry creek beds. Farmers who knew livestock moved quietly with the birds and dingoes, learning the timing and rhythm of the coordinated strikes. Lien taught how to use simple whistles and leaf smoke patterns to cue flocks. Tom, who had once driven cattle for long days, learned to follow a mob of wallabies and anticipate their turning points. Maya became the middleman between people and animal behavior, waving her hands and holding up strips of cloth soaked in Nor's distillate. At first it was clumsy. Humans moved too predictably, too loudly. A plan to use sheep as a decoy left them balking when a flock of cockatoos began to attack the herd's transport truck. Then, slowly, there were moments that felt like learning to dance. A ranger would lift a stick painted in bright colors while a handler released a pigeon. The pigeon would fly a path that drew a pod into a ditch. A pair of trained kelpies drove a line of small marsupials past a tower base until the marsupials tripped a buried cable that jammed a rotor. The animals did the hard, precise work in ways humans could not. Maya entered a damaged pod with Lien and Nor one afternoon, wearing gloves and a borrowed mask. Its shell glittered with sand. The interior smelled of burnt resin. Inside they found a panel with tiny glyphs and a faint screen. Nor touched the screen and it answered with a short burst of light. On the recorder, a sequence wove out, tones and tones that made the hairs on Maya's neck stand up. They learned enough from the shard to replicate a simple cue. It was not control, it was persuasion. The human-made cue did not force animals to act against their instincts. Instead, it fit into the new language and suggested a pattern. The animals, already primed by the alien compound, took the suggestion and completed the moves with a speed and intelligence no one had predicted. Hope changed the mood. People who had slept in their cars returned to tents and lab vans. Farmers offered tractors. An old woman named Elsie came with a crate of rescued cockatoos from her aviary and set them free near a captured pod. The birds attacked the pod like a living key fitting a lock. They tore at a vent and left the device in pieces, feathers and metal tangled together. Not everyone trusted this alliance. Some soldiers felt the animals were unpredictable and dangerous. They argued for a scorched earth approach, burn the scrub and flush the machines. Maya argued otherwise. If you burn the scrub, she said, voice steady, you burn the language the animals use to talk. You cut out our only allies. Her words hit and landed unevenly. The next test came sooner than anyone expected. A new tower began to pulse near a river bend that supplied water to a town downstream. If the tower succeeded, the town would lose its wells. The coalition decided to act. They would not send soldiers first. Instead, they would use the animals like a river of living tools. They moved at dusk. Cattle trucks sat as cover while a group of volunteers released canisters of the mimic distillate in a wide arc. Birds followed. Bats swooped to blind sensors. Termites undermined base plates. Meanwhile, kelpies herded a line of wombats to dig small channels that redirected a narrow flow of water into a trench that suddenly flooded a tower's base. The machine hiccuped, shorted, and died. When it collapsed, a cheer went up that sounded like rain. People clapped each other on the back, and animals milled and preened as if nothing had happened. Maya watched the wedge-tailed eagle ease down and perch on the dead tower like a judge. Around the fire that night, the alliance tasted real and sharp. In the quiet between plans, Maya sat with Noor and listened to a recording slowed down. Beneath the tones they heard something new, a faint pattern of surprise, almost like a human gasp. The alien signal had not predicted resistance built from life. The machines had not expected to be read by soil and wing. Maya let out a long breath and felt for the first time that humans had a place in the fight that fit more than bullets. They could be translators and stewards, not conquerors. The land had opened a door, one that asked for listening before answering. She did not know if it would be enough. But somewhere in the skin of Australia, a new kind of war had become a new kind of partnership, and that kept her awake with a wary joy. They called it the anchor when the reports came through. A pale column rising off the coast toward the mothership, a machine the invaders were building to change the air itself. If it finished, the weather would bend to their design. Winds rerouted, humidity sucked out, storms seeded. Whole coastlines could shift. The towns along the eastern seaboard watched the sea with a new kind of fear. The anchor was not near the outback, but its effect would reach everywhere. Maya read the map and felt a cold line through her gut. The coalition met under a sky the color of steel. Military planners wanted to hit the mothership directly. Bombs dropped from jets, missiles fired. Scientists warned that destroying a device of that scale could scatter debris into reefs and clouds and kill millions of sea creatures. The animals could not be sacrificed for a human plan. Maya thought of the way the wildlife had adapted, how they struck parts, not faces. She suggested a different approach: guide and trap, not destroy. We can't let it finish, Lian said. But neither can we blow up the ocean. Noor and the field team had put together a bold idea. If they could short the anchor's control nodes while it was still assembling near the reef, its tether to the mothership might fail and the whole thing could fall harmlessly into a void of sea, or at worst, sink where the coral was already dead. It would take timing, animals, and a human carriage of risk. The plan needed a way to distract defense drones and pull support towers away long enough for a precise strike on the anchor's nodes. They needed a lure. The mimic distillate could steer animals. Human teams could carry signals that suggested safety routes to flocks. Maya thought of the wedge-tailed eagle and the croc and the ants. If they could orchestrate a layered diversion, sky, land, and water, the anchor might be left vulnerable. The operation ran like a dark clock. Teams moved at dawn, boats slipping out under cloud cover with crates of devices and barrels of distillate. Farmers and rangers led convoys inland to tie up towers in the outback. Fishermen released nets in a pattern that would draw marine drones away from the assembly site. The animal forces took the cues. A trained squad of pelicans and gulls followed a boat's wake and dove over mock food drops, sending waterborne sensors reeling. A line of dingoes and wallabies ran skirting routes to pull ground units southwest, away from supply lines. Maya rode in a dust-caked Uda toward a ridge where she could see the sea far off. Tom sat beside her, quieter than he had been. He had a scar on his hand where a pod had shocked him. He flexed it now as if feeling for something. "If this fails," he said, voice low, "we could lose more than houses." Maya did not answer with bravado. She thought of the child with the scorched hand, the farmer whose shed had burned when a pod shorted electricity, and the way the animals had taken blows like a living wall. "We won't let them finish," she said. "We can't." That was enough for now. At the reef, machines worked like surgeons assembling a strange skeleton. The anchor rose with slow, terrible grace, a column of metal and crystal that drank the sea air. Drones patrolled in silent arcs like moons. The mothership above thinned the light below, washing the water in a faint alien glow. The lure began. Gull squadrons dove into baited runs while kelpies drove frantic herds toward false corridors. The mimic signals coaxed a line of turtles to the east, which attracted marine collectors and left the assembly zone quieter. Sensors, starved of usual noise, swung their attention to the east. The mothership compensated, sending a handful of defense units downward. Those units found themselves met not by men and missiles but by a living wall, a moving reef of dolphins and orcas, guided by fishers with old calls and new distillate. Maya watched the defense drones circle away from the anchor and toward the living decoy. For a heartbeat, the sea seemed to hold its breath. The team on a small auxiliary boat, Nor, Lien, and a pair of technicians, moved in with a compact EMP device cobbled from recovered alien circuitry and terrestrial materials. They had one shot: short the anchor's auxiliary nodes in sequence to trigger a failsafe that would drop its power matrix. On shore, Tom and a team of handlers led a wave of birds and marsupials to a ridge where a supply line for the anchor passed. The animals tore at cables, chewed through synthetic sheathing, and struck at power nodes. Soldiers arrived to defend the line, but they found themselves boxed in by swarms of insects and a tangle of kangaroos that smashed equipment in their path. Men and machines stalled as the wild forces moved with the simple cruelty of weather. Inside the reef's narrow lagoon, Nor keyed the EMP. The device answered with an alien whine and a flaring of blue. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the anchor shuddered, a sound like steel groaning in the wind. Towers along its base emitted a short, sickly scream as control matrices blinked. Up above, the mothership pulsed in alarm and a thin thread of light reached down as if to rescue its child. The anchor, freed from precise guidance, began to list. Something went wrong. A defense drone detached from the dolphin line and turned toward Nor's boat. It fired a beam that sliced through the water with a sound like a struck drum. Nor's hand steadied, and she re-aimed the EMP to the node the beam had not yet reached. The wave of current hit metal and the anchor hiccuped. For a breath the structure held. Then the sea took over. A wall of redirected water, driven by wombat-dug channels and a narrow human-made surge, poured into the trench below the anchor and pushed against its base. The machine tilted, and with the terrible inevitability of a tall thing losing balance, it fell. The mothership's tether snapped like a cord, and the anchor, massive and slow, tipped into the deep. The fall sent a green, terrible plume of water and debris skyward. The sound rolled to the shore like thunder. Ships rocked. Coral gasped. For a moment the world seemed to tip. No one celebrated like a victory song. There were shouts and cries and silent hands over mouths. The sea took the anchor and the reef took the fall. Fish died. Some coral crushed. Birds circled the plume as if bewildered. But the catastrophic plan had been stopped before it spread across whole weather systems. The mothership started to pull away, wounded and uncertain, and for the first time it moved not with confidence but with haste. Tom lay on the beach later that night, salt drying in his beard. He touched his scar and said nothing. Nor returned, exhausted and shaking. Some dolphins had been caught in debris. Some fish had been killed by the sudden mechanical failure. The cost of stopping the anchor was sharp and immediate. Maya walked the shoreline with Lien, boots sinking into wet sand. They watched dolphins surface and then flare away wary. "We stopped them," Maya said finally. "But we did not win without paying." Lien nodded. "We made a choice," she said. "We weighed the sea against the sky and chose the lesser harm." The mothership retreated the next day, withdrawing several kilometers and cloaking its repairs. It had not been destroyed, only delayed. The invaders would learn and adapt. But their plan to remold the air had failed because people had listened to the land and the sea and rallied in ways machines could not predict. Around campfires later, the coalition mourned the losses. The fish, the coral, the injured animals. They wrote lists of what to heal and how. The sea would recover slowly. The animals would heal slowly. Humans would have to learn, again and again, how to act like part of an ecosystem rather than its master. Maya looked at the stars and felt the weight of tomorrow. If the invaders returned, they would come smarter. The world had bought a reprieve, it had not won a peace. Still, on that night, people slept with the knowledge that life had arms neither metal nor missile could match. The anchor had fallen. The fight had turned. The mother ship withdrew like a tired storm, hanging beyond sight where dark clouds met the upper air. 4 weeks the sky above Australia stayed quiet but watchful. The towers that had once sprouted like black trees lay broken in gullies and on ridges. Metal casings turned into salt-bent sculptures. People moved through the ruined places with the slow, exact work of healers. Patching nets, replacing wiring, collecting shards for study. The land smelled of smoke and gum and burned metal. Maya walked the coast at dawn, the place where the anchor had fallen still a bruise on the water. The tide had pulled a dark line of oil and debris into sheltered coves. A team of fishers and biologists set out lines of booms and nets, scooping dying fish and oil-slick birds into crates. Volunteers scrubbed feathers and rinsed sand. Some reefs would take years to mend. Some reefs might never be the same. That was the hard part. No clean victory existed. Everything had a price. Still there were gains. Where towers had poisoned springs, new channels dug by wombats and people rerouted clean water back to creek beds. Where pods had scarred bark, young saplings shot up from seed banks. The animals returned, in numbers and with a caution that made them wiser. Kangaroos grazed where they'd once stamped. Cockatoos nested in trees that had been patched and cabled to hold. The land adapted because that is what life does. Maya visited town halls and radios, but she did not crave headlines. She wanted the quiet work, teaching farmers how to make mimic distillate safely, teaching rangers to read the altered calls without panicking, teaching children how to respect the land that had defended them. She set up a small lab in a shed with Noor, Jara, and Lien. They cataloged the pod fragments and ran cleanups. Noor's distillate became a measured tool, distributed in small vials with instructions and warnings. It could guide, but it could not control. At night Maya listened to recordings slowed and stretched until the alien tones smeared into something like breath. In those echoes, she heard not malice but a kind of astonished confusion. The invaders' logs, later recovered from a damaged probe, showed a pattern of surprise. Their models had treated Earth like data to be reordered. They had not expected the planet to answer. The recovered logs contained a clip that Nora translated with the help of a language algorithm. The voice, if it could be called that, sounded like wind in a pipe. It said, in a syntax the team could map poorly, a phrase that Nora turned into a line of English words: unexpected agency. Defense active. The line felt small and shocking. The invaders had learned a truth that many humans still refused. Earth was not empty. Some people wanted to keep fighting in older ways. Military planners pushed for stronger weapons, for programs to build machines that could dominate. The coalition argued back. You cannot win by burning the place you wish to keep, Jara told them once, palms flat on a map. Think with the country, not over it. Slowly policy shifted. Governments listened when the evidence was clear. Technology that ignored ecosystems failed. Rules were written about mining for alien tech and about environmental triage. No one claimed the sea or the scrub could be made safe forever, but a new respect grew in meetings and in small towns. Humans had to be learners more than masters. People told stories. At night around fires, the tale of the day the animals rose became a kind of truth taught to children. Maya heard versions altered and funny and fierce. A boy in town drew a mural of a kangaroo with a band of cockatoos on its back and called it the Guard. A woman wrote a simple song that people hummed when they checked water pumps. The HFY thread, hopeful human, ran through these small acts. People had listened and changed. People had chosen to work with life instead of forcing it. There were also losses that did not mend. Tom's farm had burned in a raid that went wrong. He returned to rebuild with hands that trembled when he talked about it. A pub keeper who had fed volunteers did not come back after the storm took his pier. The names of those lost were read aloud at gatherings, and then placed into a circle of stones near the ridge where Maya had first seen the ship. People left shells and feathers there. The place did not feel like victory. It felt like a promise. One clear morning, months after the anchor fell, the coalition gathered to open a small research center on the ridge. Scientists, indigenous elders, rangers, and children stood together. Jera spoke first, his voice steady. "We did not win by fire," he said. "We won by listening." The crowd broke into quiet applause. Maya spoke last. She kept her words simple. "They thought of us as a problem to solve," she said. "We showed them we were neighbors. The animals were not weapons. They were our oldest allies. We chose to listen and to answer. That is the strength of being human here." A child released a healed cockatoo from a palm and it flew up, circling the crowd once before heading for the gum trees. The bird's scream was bright and ordinary. Someone laughed, and then a chorus of voices rose: people, animals, wind. In the months that followed, researchers published papers about biosphere networks and alien interference. The world debated ethics and repair and the maps of power that had broken. Some governments banned attempts to weaponize the mimic distillate. Others sponsored programs to teach ecological listening. The mothership did not return in force. It lingered on the edge of the map, sending small probes that found empty towers and quiet reefs. Each probe came back with data showing adaptation: forests of cranes where towers had been, salt lakes refilled, an eagle that had nested on a crashed hull. Years later, when Maya walked a trail that had once been a supply line, she saw children climbing a painted tower of metal that had been turned into a playground. A sign hung nearby, in memory of what we learned. She touched the wood and felt grain and growth, and the wedge-tailed eagle called overhead like a punctuation mark. The recovered alien log ended with a short, grainy line that Noor had kept on a sealed drive. When she played it for the team one afternoon, they listened with a mix of dread and curiosity. The voice that had once called the land a resource now sounded small. It said, "They defend themselves." The sentence had no triumph. It was a report. Maya smiled, a small, honest thing. "Yes," she said simply. "They do." Outside, a child chased a wallaby with laughter bubbling open. The animals and the people moved together, wary and partnered. Australia had been a battlefield, a reef a casualty, a coastline bruised. But in the way deserts flower after rain, life had knit its wounds. The story they would tell was not only of machines and metal, but of the stubborn, practical courage of living things, human and non-human, that refused to be moved without a voice. The final image that closed the record was simple: a cockatoo taking off from a broken pod, shaking sand from its talons, and flying up into a sun that had not been conquered but lived in.
Subscribe my channel. Thanks for watching. See you in next video.